There are animals sitting frozen beneath the ground right now that have been locked inside permafrost, riverbed sediment, ancient amber for anywhere from 10,000 to over 100 million years. The details of what scientists actually find when they dig these things up are genuinely disturbing. Most animals that die disappear within weeks. But in places like Siberia and northern Canada, the ground is so permanently frozen that the usual process of decomposition just stops completely. The animal gets sealed inside the frost exactly as it was the moment it died, fur intact, organs preserved, sometimes even blood still liquid underneath the surface, thousands of years later. Scientists who crack open these frozen specimens aren't looking at fossils or impressions left in stone. They're looking at the actual animal, preserved in a way that's almost hard to believe is real. Today we're going over 6 of the most terrifying prehistoric animals ever pulled out of frozen ground. What researchers found when they finally got a close look at them. The first one is a woolly mammoth named Yuka. The most likely cause of death is that she fell into a lake or got completely stuck in a bog and couldn't pull herself free. That is a genuinely terrible way to go for an animal that size. When researchers recovered Yuka from the ice, her fur was still attached, her trunk tissue was intact, her tongue was still there. A significant portion of her soft internal anatomy had survived in remarkable condition. That alone would have made her one of the most important mammoth specimens ever found. But then researchers discovered something carved into her hide that completely changed what scientists understood about early humans in the Arctic. There were deliberate cut marks across her body, clean and precise, made by what appeared to be stone tools wielded by human hands roughly 39,000 years ago. Prehistoric people had butchered this animal, processed her body for food or materials, left the evidence permanently etched into her skin for researchers to find tens of thousands of years later. That detail alone made Yuka one of the earliest known pieces of direct evidence placing human beings in the Arctic at all. But even that wasn't the most unsettling part. When scientists were physically examining her tissue during the analysis, they pressed into the flesh and dark red blood came flowing out. Living, liquid blood from a mammoth that had been frozen for 39,000 years. That was the first time in recorded human history anyone had ever retrieved flowing blood from a woolly mammoth. Researchers believe the blood likely carried a biological antifreeze compound that prevented it from fully crystallizing even through tens of thousands of years of sub-zero temperatures, an adaptation that probably helped the species survive brutal Arctic winters during the Pleistocene. When scientists examined the cellular material from that recovered blood, the nuclei were still showing signs of biological activity, Yuka isn't just a preserved body. She's a potential cloning candidate. Scientists have seriously discussed using her genetic material to bring woolly mammoths back as a living species at some point in the future. The next animal was discovered in 2014 by a man named Alexander Bandarov, who was sailing past a river ravine in Siberia when something caught his attention hanging out of the frozen embankment high above the water. He pulled his boat over expecting to find something ordinary like a reindeer carcass, and instead came face to face with something that had been locked in that ice for roughly 34,000 years. What fell from the frozen bank at his feet was a baby woolly rhinoceros. Scientists named the specimen Sasha after Alexander. That turned out to be an oddly fitting name given that after extensive physical analysis and repeated attempts, researchers still cannot determine with certainty whether Sasha was biologically male or female. What they could determine was that the rhino was approximately 7 months old at the time of death and already nearly 5 feet long, meaning this baby rhinoceros at 7 months was physically larger than a fully grown modern African rhinoceros would typically be at a year and a half old. When scientists began preparing the body for deeper study, they fully expected the fur to be degraded and dull after so many thousands of years underground. Instead, the coat came back thick, soft, completely intact all the way down to the dense insulating undercoat layered beneath the longer outer guard hairs. The texture of that fur confirmed predictions scientists had been working with for decades about how woolly rhinoceroses were physically built to handle extreme cold. In the summer of 2016, a gold miner working in Canada's Yukon Territory was using a high-pressure water hose to blast through a frozen rock face when a small shape began melting out of the wall directly in front of him. It wasn't gold. What emerged from the ice was a wolf pup, so perfectly preserved that when researchers examined her closely, they could still make out the individual papillae on the surface of her tongue. The pup was named Zhur, drawn from the local indigenous language and translating simply to wolf. She had been frozen inside that permafrost for over 57,000 years. She was only about 7 weeks old when she died, still in the earliest and most fragile stages of puppyhood. Her face was almost completely indistinguishable from the face of a modern wolf pup, despite dying longer ago than modern humans have been the dominant species on this planet. Researchers ran full X-rays, extracted DNA samples, and studied her isotope levels in detail. The isotope analysis produced a result nobody expected. Hers diet was almost entirely aquatic, meaning she had been eating fish almost exclusively at 7 weeks old, in a region where the expected prey for any wolf at that time would have been bison or caribou. To this day, scientists have no satisfying explanation for why a wolf pup that young was surviving almost entirely on fish. How she ended up frozen inside a wall of permafrost in the Yukon, or what actually killed her. She is currently the most complete Ice Age wolf ever documented. She's small enough to fit entirely inside the palm of a single hand. In 2016, paleontologists excavating in the Yakutia region of Siberia found 2 cave lion cubs buried 7 meters underground, just a few meters apart from each other. They'd been down there for approximately 12,000 years. The speed at which they were originally frozen was so extreme that their whiskers were still physically attached, and their fur was completely intact when they came out of the ground. Scientists were able to count the individual toes on each paw and clearly make out the shape of each cub's face. The cubs were later named Uyan and Dina after the nearby Uyandina River. Both were estimated to be around 2 weeks old at the time of death, meaning their eyes hadn't even fully opened yet, and their adult teeth were still forming inside their gums beneath the surface. The most likely explanation is that a landslide collapsed the den while the mother was out hunting, burying both cubs before she could return. The preservation was so complete that researchers spent years attempting to determine whether any traces of the mother's milk could still be detected inside the cubs' stomachs. Cave lions as a species were significantly larger than any modern African lion and ruled across Europe and Siberia during the Ice Age with no natural predators. Sitting at the absolute top of the food chain for thousands of years, it's hard not to notice that the only frozen representatives of one of the most dominant predators the Ice Age ever produced. Said are 2 cubs who died at 2 weeks old in a collapsed den before their eyes had even opened. In photographs, they look like they fell asleep less than an hour ago. In 2011, a heavy equipment operator named Sean Funk was running an excavator at an oil sands mine in Alberta, Canada, when his machine scraped against something buried in the ground that clearly wasn't a rock. Workers spent several careful weeks extracting the object by hand. What eventually came out of the earth was a 110 million-year-old Nodosaur, a heavily armored herbivore from the Cretaceous period that is now considered the most well-preserved large dinosaur specimen ever recovered. It isn't particularly close. The actual skin of the animal was still sitting directly on top of its armor plating when it emerged from the ground. A team of specialists then spent over 7,000 hours across multiple years carefully preparing the specimen for scientific study. When researchers analyzed the pigment still present in the preserved skin, they found that the Boreolopelta markmicheli had a reddish-brown coloration across its upper body that likely functioned as camouflage despite the animal already being completely covered in heavy armor plating and sharp spikes. The fact that a dinosaur so thoroughly armored it could survive direct contact with most predators of its era still needed camouflage to move around safely, says quite a bit about how relentlessly dangerous the Cretaceous period actually was as an environment. In 2018, a researcher named Anastasia Sakharova was working in a laboratory with ancient frozen soil samples that had been pulled from the Siberian permafrost 16 years earlier. Those samples originally came from a fossilized squirrel burrow that scientists had located buried 40 meters below the Arctic surface. When Anastasia added water to the thawed sediment, the material moved. The soil contained microscopic roundworms called nematodes that had been sitting in a state of cryptobiosis, a form of suspended animation where all biological activity completely halts, for over 46,000 years. These worms had entered that frozen state during the Pleistocene epoch, when woolly mammoths were still crossing Siberia and modern humans had barely begun spreading beyond Africa. They stayed completely motionless inside that ancient squirrel burrow until Anastasia accidentally revived them by adding water in a lab in 2018. Within hours of being thawed, the worms were actively feeding. Shortly after that, they began cloning themselves without any need for a mate to reproduce. The species was completely unknown to science before that moment and was subsequently named Panagrolimus kalimaensis. They showed no apparent negative effects from spending 46 millennia frozen underground. That is remarkable in a way that gets harder to sit with the longer you think about it.